Hi, everyone. Welcome to this July 25th edition of The Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and thank you so much for making us a part of your summer. I know it is a super busy day out there. I know it's a super busy week. And as evidenced by Warren here in Eastern Canada, Warren Schneckenberger is out watching from the fields while he's spraying his corn. And I'm going to have to get the pronunciation on this, Veltima on corn. I don't know. Our guest is going to correct me in a moment. But before I bring them in, of course, I want to remind everybody for catching the show tonight, you do qualify for CEU credits if that's something you collect. So head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist. Tomorrow morning, we'll have the post there and you can let us know that you followed along and get your CEU credits. And of course, we do have some show sponsors that we'd love to thank for making all of this happen. And our show sponsors tonight are Mind Your Farm Business, the Wheat School, and ADAMA Canada. A big thanks to them. While other sources of innovation run dry, ADAMA is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. Okay, tonight we are talking tar spot and gibberella. So not exclusively a Eastern Canadian thing, but definitely pretty Ontario focused tonight. But shout out to Ray DeBanco joining us from Calgary. Don't worry, there will be some fun learning for all. But tar spot definitely one of those diseases that we are really having to deal with here in Ontario. So let's bring on our experts, Mr. Ken Currah with BASF and Greg Stopps with Corteva. It is a battle of the brands, shall we say. Dun, dun, dun. Also, I missed the memo about the facial hair. I apologize to everyone. Next time, I will get it right. Anyway, Greg, welcome here. First time on the Agronomists.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I usually catch this in podcast form, and usually this is about bedtime for the kids. I'm pleased to actually step away from that tonight to get to do this. This is very freeing.
Well,
Thanks.
yeah, there we go. Well, we do appreciate it. And Mr. Kinkara, how are you?
I'm great, Lindsay, and good evening. And it's Veltima, and we'll all take a
Veltima.
pass on the facial hair, so you can just check that one
Okay.
off the list.
Okay. Veltima. Okay. Next time, to both your companies, when they're naming things, could they run it past a few people that are going to have to say it on air so that we can correct, so that we can learn it first? Anyway, I do actually wish sometimes when the press releases come out, there's like, you can hit the button. It's like, say this name for me. I kind of wish we could. So maybe slip that into your marketing department's suggestion box. And then we'll get it right,
Mm-hmm.
Ken. We really will. Okay, so both of you based in Southern Ontario, but both of you put a lot of miles out on the landscape in the average summer. So, Ken, I'll start with you. How are things looking? It's late July. How are things around where you are with that crop?
Yeah, so my territory is basically St. Thomas to Niagara Falls, south of the 401, and on the North Shore of Lake Erie. So I have isolated pockets of really, really good ground in my territory, but I mean, the east half is predominantly heavy clay. I've got some more kind of heavier clay loams in the London St. Thomas Fingal corridor, and then I've got the Norfolk Sand Plain, and I've got the gravel plain from kind of Brantford, Paris up to Kitchener. Um, that ground's been under a lot of stress. So the corn crop, I mean, last year we were talking fungicide. I think most agronomists and a lot of farmers realized they had the chance for a pretty big crop if the rest of the season came together. This year it's been under a lot of stress. It's having to defend itself. We've got the drought stress. We've got some soil quality issues that reared their heads after last fall and that tough harvest season in October and early November, and the corn crop shows it. We've had 3 or 4 rain events in the last week that are helping recover some acres, but yeah, it's a bit of an up and down crop.
Absolutely. All right, Greg. And you have a different territory, close to, but not quite the same. What do things look like there?
Yeah, so I kind of pick up where Ken is on my southern edge, really. Kind of, I cover the north end of London, up along Lake Huron, up the heart of Perth, Huron, and Bruce counties, and a little bit of other surrounding counties. But things are looking a little bit tough with some stress. Pretty variable is how I'd say. There's some good crops out there. There's some poor looking ones, but even the best looking cornfields out there are showing some variability. Right, we had tremendous success last year in terms of yields, but we had some tough going at harvest time with some severe wet weather that has led to some compaction issues and all kinds of those things that Ken already kind of alluded to. We're seeing those same things up here. We're seeing drought stress pretty widely spread. Not everywhere. There are pockets that have certainly got some rains, and we've recently received some pretty saving rains as we head into tassel here. So we're very thankful for that. But it has been a hot and dry season that's led to a lot of variability in all of the crops.
Now, let's put it in perspective a little bit when we say, a challenging fall. I think, Greg, in your area, there were definitely some areas that have something like 7 inches of rain in a very short amount of time. Like, we're not talking like, hey, it was a little wet. Like, we're talking pretty extreme fall conditions.
Yeah, and absolutely, it was pretty extreme, pretty wet. Understandable that a little bit of damage was done.
Yeah.
Not ideal, not what anyone wanted, but certainly we're seeing a little bit of compaction from that.
hmm Ken, in your areas as well?
Yeah, in my area as well, and I think one of the hypotheses that's out there that I subscribe to is we had a couple of periods where a day or two in May got really, really hot. And I know when we
hmm
first got into planting corn in my territory, that'd be the 7th, 8th of May, somewhere in there. The odd early farm went in, in the first week of May. But I mean, the 7th and 8th really kind of kicked in, and we had a big week, right? Big 7 to 10 day
hmm
period. A lot of growers that run the loams and the clay loams commented that they were making a seed bed up top, but they really didn't like the conditions 3 to 6 inches down. That's
hmm
that's last October and November's weather, right? And
Yeah.
I postulate that the heat we got in mid May and then a couple more days at the end of May just seemed to make that ground really really tough. And we have it's almost behaving like a planting sin, right? I mean, that one's
Right.
not on the farmer. That's just we haven't had the rain to forgive that weather sin, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, a question has come in already, which is it's already been up there for a little bit, but definitely I think an indication of how much a lot of this is on farmers' minds. And we are, of course, focused on Gibberella and on tar spot. And of course, in line with Gibberella, we'll be talking about Western bean cutworm, which of course have been spotted this week. But Patrick wants to know, with only 2.5 inches of rain since May 20th, corn is everywhere from 2.5 to 7 feet tall. Is there a point where it's not worth spraying fungicides on corn? So, two things I kind of take out of that is variable corn is managing that, and short corn. So, the two things, they can be happening in the same field or they can be completely separate. But Greg, I'll start with you. On a field that's really variable like that, what goes into making that call on protecting that crop?
So a large part of what goes into that call for me is just what are you targeting with that fungicide, right? Depending on what your operation is and what your risk factors are. So, for example, if you're a hog grower and you are in an area that struggles with jib, which is what we're going to talk more about tonight, right? Then I'm very tempted to continue with that fungicide program, right? To hopefully relieve some of the stress that the crop might be under and to ease the pressure from potential jib inoculation and dawn development in the crop, right? Of course, if the crop is incredibly stressed or incredibly variable, right, we're going to have to look at how much of the field really is variable and
Mm-hmm.
either, go ahead with spraying and then figure out how to time that correctly for the best chunk of the field anyway, or we're going to have to look at maybe we just count our losses and don't apply to that individual field. And I think there are some of those scenarios out there where it
Mm.
probably isn't worth the return, where things are extremely stressed, and we should just kind of count our losses.
Ken, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so this is pretty typical of the conversations I've had for the last 10 to 14 days now with growers and the retail agronomists in my territory, which and every conversation is different. You really do have to understand as Greg mentioned, what are you targeting, right? I mean, the discussion on Gibberella and vomitoxin management, that's different for every producer in terms of their tolerances, and certainly some have more tolerance to be able to manage some Gibberella risk versus certainly the hog producer and hog feeder can't, right? If we're just targeting the foliar diseases, and the primary two are tar spot and northern corn leaf blight, and we're looking for that fungicide application for the plant health and that yield boost and that increased standability and whole plant intactness in the fall, yeah, we got to figure out how much of that field is the best crop, right? You know, once we get in past the headlands, have we got a decent enough area of good crop in there? Usually in agronomy, the general rule is you manage your first crop because it's your best crop, and you manage your best acres. So you've really got to figure that out. And every situation is different for a consulting agronomist to be talking to their customer. I mean, average selling price for a cash grain seller, right? You know, figuring all that together, and you know, what are their needs and what are you targeting? If you're a smaller producer, let's say you have 200 acres of corn, and a custom operator usually does it, and you've done fungicide in the past, but you're looking at this variable droughted compacted crop, and maybe I don't need fungicide. Well, you better have a conversation with your custom harvester and see if an early harvest fits into his or her you know, fall schedule. Or are they going to be tied up all over in beans, right? In which case they're not coming to do your corn early. So every situation is different, and we have to walk through all those scenarios.
My 200 acres matters, Ken. I'm just kidding. I don't have 1 acre of corn, everybody. I have exactly 4 sweet corn plants growing outside. They are Charlie's. Anyway, really good point though, Ken, on the early harvest part, right? So thinking through the entire growing season and where you're going to end up, if you don't go in with that fungicide, think about then later on. And actually the clip we have coming back sort of talks about that standability and about those issues perhaps come fall. So Peter did want to get at least one dig in though, Ken, when you were talking about the compaction, that 2-3 inches down. The hide speed discs just solve all those compaction problems though, right? I mean, that just...
you know what? You're going to see Peter's hat vibrating in one of these clips later in this show, and if I wore the same hat, mine would be vibrating right now too. And
yeah, there you go. Okay.
There you go.
It's pretty good. Yeah, we know how much you love high-speed discs. Okay. Yeah, no, we are. Let's. Possibly. Yeah. So. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So I do want to make sure that everyone in the comments, we are talking tar spot and we are talking Gibberella. So by all means, you know, if you want to talk one over the other and we jump back and forth, I'm pretty sure these lads can handle that. So by all means, ask those questions, get them in early so that we make sure that we cover everything. I think we'll go where I think we'll go to the tar spot. Now let's go Jib first. Let's go with that Peter Johnson clip that you mentioned, Ken. Let's go to the Peter Johnson clip, producer Jay, and then we'll work into, because I do want to talk about Western bean cutworm and talk about that the different ways that this corn crop gets sort of mangled by this. So Jay, if you will, Peter Johnson, pretending he knows about corn.
We have trouble with the Ontario corn crop. Now, first off, don't panic. It's not everywhere because there are still dry pockets in the province. It's unbelievable how variable things are out there. But in the rain zone, and there's a lot of the province that has been in the rain zone after July 20th. Most of us dry up till July 20th. Some it was August 1st. But in August, almost the entire month, we had 100% relative humidity. It rained almost every day. And of course, those are perfect conditions for Gibberella in the corn crop. So absolutely, we have Gibberella, same thing as Fusarium, same disease, just goes sexual, and lots of things that we can see. So you can see right away, we have this pink mold growth at the tip. What's going on? Because it was dry at pollination, and we would have said, man, dry at pollination. In fact, we scouted cornfields. We said, no need to spray with a fungicide this year because it's so dry and the corn is pollinating, no chance of Fusarium. Well, it rained right at pollination, and any late cobs, any late pollination in that corn crop or the longer season maturity, we have silk channel infection. 2016, we had a big problem in the Ontario corn crop. It was almost all western bean cutworm. So the western bean cutworm chewed into the cob, it opened that cob up for fusarium. We had tremendous vomitoxin issues in that corn crop. This year, almost no western bean cutworm. I mean, there certainly is some. We're getting reports, but very, very low levels. And in this field, we don't find any western bean cutworm. We're still finding the fusarium. The other thing that's really interesting, so this is a bad cob, but there's lots of cobs where it's not this bad, and we get sprouted kernels. And so you'll go to a field and you'll take that cob and you'll open it up and you'll say, why is that sprouted kernel there? That is the first symptom of that gib getting in there. It actually affects the hormone balance in the kernel and it makes them sprout. So we have sprouted kernels here. You see that occasionally here as well. Get out there and scout because we're staying damp, we're staying humid. Anytime corn is over 19% moisture, this fungus will grow. The longer it grows, the more toxin it creates. If it's over 9 Celsius, it grows. Those are kind of the conditions. We're in a warm period, it's wet, this stuff is just going gangbusters. When you walk to the field, it's pretty easy. You can pretty much tell just by looking at the husk. So here's a cob here, almost for sure there's some fusarium or some gibberella starting to grow there, just by that tightness and that pink kernel. So or the pink rather on the outside of the cob. So you really look at it and say, yeah, we go down here and we open up cobs and we're finding in here that about 1 in 5 cobs has some of this mold starting. They're not all that bad, but what really does worry me is even the ones, this one clearly silk channel infection, you can see that we're moving down the cob. But even where we have the earlier pollinated crop, it's not silk channel infection. We see a little bit of pink on the top. We open that cob up and what we're finding is that the gibberella has started to infect this part of the cob. It's turning this part of the cob to mush. We don't see the pink growth here, but it's going to move down the cob. The longer we leave it, the more we're going to get it into the kernels. And so this cob's going to become mush. It becomes mush, really hard to harvest. Lots of reasons to get out there and scout because trying to take those kernels off a mushy cob, you know what that's like in the combine.
Oh, we've got some questions coming in, most of them about Peter's hat. Just kidding. All right, before we dig in a little bit more into Gibberella, I do want to send a shout out to, of course, our show sponsors, ADAMA Canada, The Wheat School, and Mind Your Farm Business. The Mind Your Farm Business podcast goes up every 2 weeks, once a month on realagriculture.com, brought to you by RBC Royal Bank. We're on 70 some episodes, almost 80. There's something for everybody in that podcast. Okay, digging into it, we've got some great questions on Tar Spot that have come in as well. But let's check in. Let's start with, as we talked about with Gibberella, that western bean cutworm damage, that sort of first step in introducing this pathogen into this corn crop. So, Greg, have you spotted egg masses yet? How many? Should we be panicking?
So luckily in my part of the world, we've seen a few, but not tremendous amounts yet. Okay. Further south of me, though, they are starting to see those numbers really climb. So, and usually we're a few days late to the game, right, in my part of the world. So we expect that they are going to be climbing, and numbers look pretty high. We've got pockets that do show really high every year. Those are areas that we know they're overwintering, and they really come hot and heavy every year in those pockets. We are expecting them to be quite high pressure this year with some of the dry conditions, which are favorable to the insect development and survival. So we're expecting to see a lot of egg masses. Now, whether or not that translates to a lot of larval survival, feeding on those ears, time will tell. But certainly something we don't like to take a lot of risks with if we're finding those egg masses pretty readily in the crop and those trap count numbers are high.
Mm-hmm. All right, Ken, what is it looking like in your territory?
Yeah, same thing. The scouts, especially in the Tobacco Belt, Tillsonburg, Cortland, Delhi area on the sands, starting to find more egg masses and finding the odd field at threshold. I find it interesting because I think historically, when western bean cutworms showed up, I think we've learned that if our corn planting window gets delayed until the middle of May, which is 2022, right? May 8th to May 20th, that seems to coincide with peak flight a lot of years versus the years where we
Okay.
get a lot of the corn crop in from the 25th to the 8th. So
Okay.
yeah, it's
And
time to get
so,
out and diagnose it.
yeah. So why does Western bean cutworm matter so much to eventual Gibberella levels? Ken, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, silk channel infection starts it, and I think even looking back at 2016, 2018, even go back to 2011 again, very similar to this year, a mid-May planting window and severe drought stress in a lot of acres leading up to pollination and silk
Mm-hmm.
development and tasseling, right? The R stages, and we saw in 2011 that particularly West Middlesex, Strathroy to Park Hill corridor, where they feed, grow a lot of corn on corn and feed it to livestock, was an issue. So yeah, it starts with silk channel infection, and then the Western bean cutworm, when it's not controlled, as we learned in 2016, can do a pretty fantastic job of spreading it. What I find interesting is the weather pattern, the environment in 2016 and 2018, fairly similar. If you walked a cornfield in the middle of August, 100 feet into it, you were wet at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Peter hit it right on the head in the video clip. No winds, high relative humidity, and some kind of precipitation almost every day. You got wet when you walked into the cornfield. The environment was very conducive, but that uncontrolled Western bean cutworm in 2016, we had those ppm levels sneaking up over 5 and towards 10 versus that 2018 crop, which is a nightmare in terms of so many acres over 10 ppm, right? That was all about environment at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just gonna shudder at that clip is from 2018, so that was still in August before we really knew how bad it got, right? So Greg, Peter Johnson has a question that I'm glad he's asking it, in that you did mention, of course, that you're not seeing as much, but definitely it's out there. So we count egg masses, but we do have trap counts. So if they've increased dramatically, if a farmer's scouting their field and can't find egg masses, which sort of indicator do you go with? When you're working with a farmer, do you need to find those egg masses in the field at a certain threshold, or do the trap counts just sort of tweak you to go and check maybe more or more thoroughly? How do you sort of marry the two scouting tools?
Well, I guess the politically correct answer is that I try to marry the two tools together and use an IPM approach, right? Understandably, that is not always the approach that everyone takes when managing their operation. But it certainly is challenging. And the way I look at it is, if I see those trap counts climbing week to week, I'm really directing my scouting in that area, trying to find those egg masses and hopefully identifying some, right? And along the way, I'm also evaluating the level of beneficial insects that are out there. And over the last few years, we've seen beneficial insects in our fields all the time, eating those eggs, right? So lots and lots of ladybugs out there on those leaves. Those are a good sign, right? Where they will control some of those egg masses and reduce some of that pressure. So if you're struggling to find those eggs on leaves, that doesn't mean you're not going to have some pressure. It's very difficult to find those at times, but you've got to try to balance that a little bit, right? And we do have set thresholds kind of in the province of how many egg masses you should find per 100 plants. I believe that's 5. I subscribe to a little lower threshold myself personally. If you find kind of 1 or 2, usually that warrants spray, at least from not so much a yield loss standpoint, but from that potential infection of gib and the complications that might mean from a dawn and a grain quality standpoint. So really, I'm looking for a slightly lower threshold with the potential of dawn development than I am with the potential of yield loss to Western bean cutworm.
Right.
And if I could go back there to just a second, like to where Ken had talked, I totally agree. Where Western bean cutworm is kind of my secondary concern when it comes to gib, right? I think we saw, like Peter mentioned in 2016, high pressure Western bean cutworm led to that secondary kind of infection, and that environment almost within the ear that allows any silk channel infection to take off a little bit more. But my primary concern, again, is usually that silk channel infection, like Ken mentioned, right? And we've had relatively dry conditions this year up until now, up until tasseling. And you might think that, oh, well, that's not going to really have any big impact on jib or shouldn't drive any jib, right? But it's really August that makes or breaks the jib in the corn crop, right? And Peter was in that clip mentioning, the conditions at which it takes off, all that leaf wetness, the high relative humidity, those warm days, right? And with a dry season leading into tasseling, it can be a little bit more concerning as you start to think about it, right? The thing that Peter mentioned was those late silks that get infected, right? And that really does hit home in a dry year, right? Where as we're heading towards tasseling, we've been under some drought stress. The very first thing that starts to get thrown off with that, Nick, is the amount of silk that we're pushing, right? Which usually leads to, and we're all used to this in dry conditions, we usually see a bit of nosing on the corn where those tip kernels don't properly pollinate. And what's happened there is those tip kernels simply weren't silking while the tassel was still shedding viable to pollen, right? So they're not getting pollinated. And those fresh silks from the tips of the ear can lay out there for a good long time and get silk channel infection in them from jib, and we can see that develop down the cob. So a dry year can be a very dangerous thing going into tassel, and we might very well see a bit of that develop as we go into August if the conditions change and start to provide that humidity that really lets jib take hold.
If I can just share, as an Easterner, way out here in Western Quebec, and maybe Warren is still on if he's still listening, we have had sort of some torrential downpours, and we're tasseling. I think we're on it's probably 7 days since I saw the first ones, but we're in full tassel, and I think we've had 2 gigantic downpours. So the humidity is through the roof, and if only it could have done this 2 weeks ago and then not, that would have been great. But we definitely seem to be, at least on the east end here, in for some pretty wet weather on and off for the next little while. So definitely need to keep that sort of first and foremost in our brains as far as infection and then development of it. I think we have, so there's always one question that comes up, and I don't know if anybody's asked it yet, but in talking about the husk itself, so with silk channel infection and that sort of stuff, I know Pete has talked about sort of, if you've got tight husks on the corn, does that increase your risk or decrease? What does sort of the characteristics of the corn plant itself sort of either increase or decrease your risk of Gibberella? Ken, I'll start with you.
Yeah, that's a fun one. We alluded more to the dry conditions and the plant under stress, right? Yeah, anything that happens to that corn plant to really hold those silk or those ear leaves to the ear, I think is a challenge. So I mean, yeah, sometimes we I think drought is probably the biggest one. I think that's the one I really look for, and Greg did a great job explaining it there. That's the one to me that we need to be mindful of. And on top of that, just the fact that if we have no wind circulation down in there, even on a green corn plant and green ear leaves, we had nice breeze today, for example, right? Dried out whatever moisture was in the canopy pretty quickly. One of my indicators on the Gibberella front in terms of risk is not just a drought pressure on the ear and on the plant, but if we see canopy moisture more than 10-12 hours a day for 3 or 4 consecutive days in this 5 to 10 day pollination window, I'm all over a fungicide for protecting on Gibberella ear rot. Right, those few consecutive days are a massive risk factor. If we're going to tear apart the the ear configurations and such, that to me is very secondary. I mean, still at the end of the day, we're selecting ears for yield and plants for disease tolerance and all those other things that drive revenue on the acre.
Mm-hmm. Now, Greg, you also mentioned, of course, those later kernels not getting pollinated, but those silks staying out. So that makes me think, of course, in a stagey field. So like Patrick related with those 2.5 foot, 7 foot, or behind, ahead. So that variability in that field makes that call even harder then because of that.
Absolutely, it does. Yeah, 100%. That variability in the field, those late silkers, those late kind of plants are going to make this a real challenge. And so, if you're thinking about managing for Gib, the best advice we can always give is try to get the bulk of the crop there, or at least the crop that you think is going to yield the best, to that correct staging for fungicide application, which is fresh silk timing, right? You want to get that fungicide applied to the fresh silk. You want to get a fungicide with preferably a triazole active ingredient applied, something that can potentially reduce that DON accumulation. And to touch just on the year characteristic side of things, I like working in the seed industry and being a part of kind of product evaluation for a long period of time now. Husk length and tightness is always something that's top of mind. It is very much, like Ken said, a secondary kind of concern, because the reality is that in the industry we try not to release potentially really jibby hybrids into the market, right? We're driving by yield, but these things kind of are on top of mind, right, in terms of characterization. But every time you think that you've got this disease figured out in terms of what drives it in the corn plant, you'll find another example in another hybrid with an equally long husk or an equally tight husk where it is relatively clean and pretty good, right? So when we're talking about the corn crop in general, my advice to growers is always lean on your seeds person, lean on your local agronomist and their knowledge of those products, their experience with those products, especially in hot spots where they typically get Gib year in, year out. Because the characteristics of a clean hybrid are relatively different. Some of them share some things in common, but take each one kind of individually and lean on the experience of the seeds person, knowing how that hybrid is going to react in your area and perform for that disease.
Gosh, you two are good. All right, Gord Speck-Snyder's got a great question here. So we're talking about humidity. We're talking about the conditions in the canopy, a gentle breeze, Ken, you mentioned. So Gord asks, are narrow rows increasing infection risk? Especially if we're talking about, Pete also mentioned perhaps the risk of Western bean cutworm spreading from plant to plant and actually acting maybe more as a vector with that discussion as well. So is row spacing enough of a risk or not risk to change it? What do you think, Ken?
I don't think so. I think there's other reason to change or not change row widths in a production system. I don't think, from a disease, whether it's Gibberella, whether it's tar spot moving by sporulation, whatever that difference. No, if you're a producer and you've decided on 20-inch rows, you have your reasons. And whether it's iron and one planter for corn and soys or whatever your reasons were, stick to your guns.
Okay. Greg, agree, disagree?
Yeah, I would agree completely with Ken. I mean, I don't tie row width specifically to the disease. I think there are other things, other real low hanging fruit that you should really focus on, right? And if you're on a 20 or a 30, the row spacing doesn't matter so much as your ability to plant that crop correctly, get it to the right depth, make sure it's up evenly, make sure that the inter-row spacing is correct, right, between plant to plant, right. Those are the things that I worry about a little bit more, right. You don't want to run the risk of having runts or too many runts in your field. Those plants tend to be higher in infection rates because of the variability that they present, right? Those kinds of things. If you can do your best to eliminate those things, the row spacing really doesn't matter. And the only other comment would be, if you are considering switching row spacing, make sure you consider how you're going to potentially apply a fungicide to that crop, right? So either leave those tram lines, make sure you have access to aerial application or something like that, right?
Yep, absolutely. Okay, Mr. Sean Schill has entered the chat. Great question. Now he farms, I don't know if you guys are aware of where Arthur is, but it is very far north, I'm told, and quite high elevation. So it's pretty much a frozen wasteland most of the year, is what I'm told. Anyway, just kidding. Okay, does a producer with a variable stand due to dryness, what's the feasibility of using satellite imagery and building a scripted fungicide application? Is it worth the hassle? This is a great question. Now, I'm going to guess he means Gibberella, but this probably ties into leaf blight, tar spot, whatever we're talking about. When we've got a really variable field, is this the year that it might be worth a script? Ken, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I love this question, and I've gotten it a couple times in the last week because of the variability in fields. And getting that look from above using satellite imagery or flying it with a drone or whatever and building that prescription application map is a great idea, right? There's especially on those variable farms, there's areas that you definitely don't need to be investing in a fungicide in. So yeah, I love the concept. Again, scripted applications of any product, whether it's fertilizer or pesticide, a fungicide, whatever. I mean, the more variability, the more it's going to be worthwhile and worth the hassle, as Sean suggests in his question. So yeah, that situation is certainly there. One thing I want to mention there, though, because I've had the question, is what about applying a lower than labeled rate to those poor areas of the field? And that is something we do not do. It's either the nozzles are on or the nozzles are off. So that's a resistance management tool. So yeah, if you've got an area that's not as good, shut the nozzles off, carry on, spray the good areas. I like the concept, I really do, and I'd be very interested in seeing some yield maps in the fall if somebody's trying that.
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, Sean. Okay, Greg, agree, disagree?
I would drive up the hill to Arthur to see Sean's yield maps.
Yep. I do largely agree, and I would just say I grew up in Mount Forest, so I would be really
here.
quite insulted on Sean's behalf if
you
what you said did ring just a little bit too true. So I'm really not. That's a frozen wasteland, maybe not wasteland part, but it certainly does get cold and runs risk of pretty early frosts up there. So I generally agree with Ken. Right? It's one of those things where, yeah, if you have access to those things and you want to play with it, I would say we've played a lot with variable sort of or prescription maps, at least in soybeans. And like Ken says, it's on or it's off. It's not half rates here and there. We've done those maps kind of for white mold pressure and sort of proven that they can kind of work. I haven't seen the same extent in corn, right? So whether or not it's really going to pay, it depends on what we're targeting here, right? And that Arthur region, and as you go further kind of north and east out of the area that I cover, you do start to see the pressure, the natural pressure of Gib that seems to have a real hot spot close to the Great Lakes Basin and further southwest. It starts to dissipate, so you don't typically get some of that. We are seeing tar spot moving into that area now too, and that might become a larger problem as a leaf disease, and it will continue to spread all the way, presumably continue on until it finds an ocean somewhere. But that Gib piece probably becomes a little bit less of a concern as you're starting to get further and further out there. So all of those things have to be taken into account in terms of what am I targeting, and then is it worth my time to go in and try to figure out how to write that script for that individual field.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, I'm glad that you're okay with me making fun of where you're from. I'll just remind everyone I'm from Manitoba, so I really am. I have nothing to say at all about cold winters, but it is very far uphill. Okay, I'm just saying. Anyway, okay, so that is a great segue though, because we're more than halfway down, and we do need to tackle tar spot. And we did have a couple questions come in right at the beginning. We are going to tackle those. So Jay, let's just to intro this discussion on tar spot. Let's head over to our clip with Albert Tenuta from. I think 2 years ago now, looking at tar spot in the Ontario corn crop.
Hey, now we're here at your nursery here, your tar spot nursery. A lot of talk about tar spot, that leaf disease that you've been looking at for a couple of years. Now I want to go back to July. We came down here in July and we saw very low levels of tar spot. What do we see then and what are we seeing now?
Oh yeah, no, from that first July 2nd where we only saw 1 or 2 lesions on the lower leaves, it started to move up. And when we were here last, we were starting to see the tar spot, those beautiful little black stromas on those leaves starting to work their way up. But it was maybe at 1, maybe 2% leaf area at that point. So very early in the disease development at that point. And now it really changed, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of, obviously, leaf disease here. You've got a lot of lodging here as well, Albert. Talk about, I guess, what type of impact the disease has had on this nursery.
Yeah, no, this has probably been you know, this has been the perfect storm for tar spot, and we've seen that in previous years in the U.S., where it's become, you know, pretty well endemic throughout the Midwest and the Great Lakes states since 2015. And so 2018, cool, moderate temperatures, wet conditions, and we've had the perfect environment here. And so that's allowed the tar spot development to continue right from that early July right up to just a few weeks ago when things started shutting down really early. So we saw the disease progress up from that 1 to 2% up to 40–50% of the leaf area on the ear leaf and above starting to be showing tar spot symptoms on there. Early shutdown, early yellowing, necrosis, the shutting down of those plants. And as you just mentioned, we're really starting to see that impact on lodging. And we did our lodging scores last week, and you can see the big differences between the untreated, no fungicides, or fungicides that aren't very effective compared to those fungicides that are, in terms of the amount of stalk breakage that we see on these parts, or that traditional lodging where you see it falling over.
Hey, talk about, I guess, the yield impact here.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, I mean, it varies through this nursery because you've got, as I say, we're going to talk about some of the different plots, but what type of, you know, impact are you seeing?
Yeah, I've been surprised this year, considering that last year in this same location, we had maybe 5–10% tar spot in this area going into the winter. We didn't have a lot of residue, and, you know, thinking, okay, you know, we'll get some degree of the disease, but boy, did it snowballed this year. And we had the perfect, as I said, the perfect environment for it. And that's going to have a significant impact on yield. We're starting to hear yields from growers' fields that had tar spot at lower levels than this, at, you know, 20 bushels more. The adjacent field here with our cooperator, our grower here, who's fabulous. If he's listening to this, I'll send it to him so he knows I'm saying nice things about him. But, you know, you're seeing up to 20, 30, 40 bushel yield difference between fungicide and not. So it is a disease that we have to be concerned about. But ultimately, the goal of this was to find out how we can, what tools do we have available, and will they work for tar spot under our conditions?
Alrighty, okay, back at it. Time to talk tar spot. Before we hop into it, though, because we've got some great questions coming in, a quick shout out to, of course, our show sponsors, to ADAMA Canada, to Mind Your Farm Business, and to the Wheat School. We love our Wheat School. I think we're on, oh goodness, it might be episode or season 11, brought to you by C&M Seed Syngenta Canada and the Alberta Wheat Commission. Head on over to wheatschool.com and check out all the fantastic episodes from some focused on Western Canada and, of course, right here in Ontario. So go check those out at wheatschool.com. Okay, let's dig into tar spot. So some questions right off the hop. Greg and Ken. So Greg, I'll start with you. Looking at that clip with Albert, you know, seeing signs in July. So here we are, we're end of July. How much tar spot are you seeing in your territory right now?
So thankfully, I'm not seeing much at all to date,
Okay.
which is a real blessing, right? We're certainly hearing where it has been spotted a little further south. I'm hearing from some of my counterparts in Michigan where they found a little bit, but nowhere near the pressure we have seen at this point in time in previous years. Now, the area that I cover just saw it come in kind of for the first time last year, right? And it came in late. There was certainly some pretty significant pressure in some areas, and then it kind of not so significant in others, or it came in very, very late and didn't really cover everything, right? So there's going to be varying levels of pressure in my area when it does come. But certainly the conditions to date have not presented themselves to have that development. Whether or not those conditions have started to change with some of these saving rains, I'm on a little bit more of a high alert now, thinking, okay, what's that done? You know, the cooler nights are back. There's a little bit more humidity. This week, I'm scouting pretty closely, right? Taking a look at fields that I think are going to be a little bit more susceptible, corn on corn, where we saw high pressure last year, where that trash exists for the disease to overwinter, those kinds of things, right? Looking really closely at those areas.
Okay. Ken, how about for you?
Yeah, so being south of Greg, and then if you look south and west of London, I mean, it's more prevalent, of course. That's just the way the distribution is and the way it's going to move in Ontario this year. How many times did Albert say the word environment in that clip? And as Greg
Mm-hmm.
alluded to,
Like
we
10.
have not had that rich environment for spreading tar spot and proliferating that disease yet. So, I mean, we're looking at more of a presence at this point. So you're targeting, geographically those areas south and west of, say, the Highway 8 corridor for sure, or Highway 7, Highway 401, 403, 402 corridor, right south and west of there. Pretty intensive scouting, trying to figure out what levels of disease pressure we have, and prioritizing accordingly. Corn on cornfields, because it overwinters on the residue. So I mean, it's a little bit more prevalent than in Greg's area, but we're certainly not yet seeing that ramping up. If you look at last year's information on leaf wetness within the canopy from Albert's trials, in
Mm-hmm.
August was the perfect environment. And of course, August coincides with the fungicide starting to wane off in activity within the plant from application, 3 to 6 weeks prior, right? But August, we had so many days over 7 or 8 hours of leaf wetness in the canopy. I think, I looked at it before the show. I think we only had 4 days out of the 30 in August that we had less than 10 hours of leaf
Right.
wetness in the canopy. So haven't had that yet, but yeah, as Greg mentioned, it's high alert time. We've had some rain events, and the humidity's still here, and it's time to scout intensively and figure this out and prioritize.
Okay, so Jake, can you bring up? Greg sent a great image of a trial looking at the genetic differences that we can see for different hybrids here. So, Greg, just quickly, what are we looking at here, and what time of year is this that we're looking at?
So this is a little bit kind of later in August, kind of around the 15th to 20th window, where you typically wouldn't expect to see corn that has turned quite as much, right? And you can clearly see some pretty brown strips. All of those strips are different hybrids, a number of them from the company that I work for, Pioneer, as well as a number of other industry hybrids that are out there quite commonly, right? And what you'll see is that there are huge differences in how much they have turned, and that is tar spot that is driving it in this picture, right? So what we know about the disease, and what Albert kind of alluded to in a longer version of some of that information that he's put out there, is that there really are some big hybrid or genetic differences out there, right? So as an industry, we are scrambling to try to figure out, what those hybrid tolerances are. There are bigger questions being asked, and full disclosure, I am not a breeder, but if I was a breeder, I'd be asking things like, are there genetic markers that can help me predict tar spot tolerance, right? Similar to how we know there are genetic markers for northern corn leaf blight and can utilize those to our advantage in a breeding program, right? We are playing catch up to some degree, trying to find out those answers on tar spot, as it is a relatively new disease. But you can bet that there are hybrid differences, and one of the ways we're going to manage through this disease, and I would say not the only way, is through genetics, right? And really what we have to do then is partner those tolerant genetics with an effective fungicide management program. This is a great photo here that's popped up. These are two separate hybrids looking down between them. They are both very close in relative maturity and should be green at this stage. The one that is green is actually rated quite well on tar spot and seems to handle it very well. The other one does not at all, as you can clearly see, and has dried down very rapidly. If you were to see the actual leaves up close, you would see the stroma all over the leaf, just taking all of that photosynthetic material out and costing that individual hybrid quite a bit of yield, and in this particular scenario where there has been no fungicide applied.
So that's none. So this is my question then, or what I want to look at sort of going forward. So we know for Gibberella, we're targeting those silks, right? We're sort of around there, but tar spot can move in later. It can, as you alluded to, we can see it sort of taking off when those fungicides that we did apply are starting to wane. So are we potentially looking at, and I'll put this to both of you, of a second application, and if so, when should we when should a farmer be timing that? When should an agronomist be looking at lining that up? Do we have that information yet on what that call is with tar spot? Ken, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so for the Ontario experience, we really don't have that information on 2-pass programs yet. I'll start with that statement. If you look at the Great Lakes Basin west of us, where the American growers have been dealing with tar spot for a decade now, it's still a pretty small percentage of acres over there that get treated with 2 passes of fungicide, say 3 weeks apart, to deal with that high tar spot pressure. And you can guess that those are, high yield areas, so high return, right? And corn on corn, like the true disease pits, but that's a very low percentage of acres that's seeing 2 passes. Most of those acres in the U.S. experience that application at tassel or silking, which is our traditional timing here in Ontario anyway for managing disease and, such as northern corn leaf blight or gibberella. This fits together pretty nice. I would encourage any producer that's looking at a 2-pass program, make sure you leave a means of evaluating it. And you should not be doing 2 passes unless your IPM process says so. We're seeing a slower spread of the disease. So, we need to do that scouting. And, if that pressure ramps back up after the first fungicide wanes and we're still well ahead of that pre-harvest interval, look at a second pass, but leave yourselves the means to evaluate it. We also saw some single pass applications last year beyond that silking and pollination time. But again, pretty limited case studies. We left the means for evaluation. But bear in mind, like high value crop, right? So easy to achieve ROI, high yielding crop, and high disease pressure last year. We have fewer super high yield acres out there this year. I think it's safe to say, right? We're going to get dragged back a little bit on yields compared to that wonderful experience last year with a lot of farmers setting their own personal best yields. So yeah, we've got to evaluate that application outside of the typical silking tassel timing and really understand what did we accomplish there.
Okay, good advice. Glad you mentioned the pre-harvest interval. That one PHI doesn't get talked about, I think, as much as it maybe should. So glad you mentioned it again. Greg, what about you? Do you have something to add to that? How are we looking for a late season pass?
Well, and again, I think we are, like Ken mentioned, learning a lot as we go through this, right? I haven't seen enough to say that we really should be putting on a 2-pass system at this point in time, right? Certainly, the way the pressure is looking this year, being very difficult to find in a lot of fields, we're not at that point where we necessarily want to be spraying for tar spot. So where I see a 2-pass system potentially playing out is more with those folks who, like we talked about earlier, are at risk of GIB and that development of that disease, followed by potentially tar spot, right? So if you're looking at an effective GIB application, right, you've got to go with your fresh silks. If you're a hog operation where you really can't take that risk on dawn, you're probably going to go ahead, apply your fungicide now. But I would be looking very closely at my field. And if I didn't have tar spot, I might be leaving some of those fungicides out of the tank and only putting in kind of my triazole-based fungicides to target that dawn production, right? Then, like Ken sort of suggested, you're leaving yourself with that option for that second pass. Should things go wrong, the weather turns, you're seeing that development and rapid kind of growth and spread of tar spot, then you have that out to come back with a more effective fungicide on tar spots in some of them that are out there, right? Now, you got to be very careful in terms of there is going to be a cutoff point, right? You mentioned pre-harvest intervals. There is going to be a point in time where it is no longer beneficial to apply that fungicide, right? And the later that crop gets in its development, the later those kernels, or the more chance those kernels have to develop, right? The less yield you're going to potentially lose from them too, right? So there is going to be a point, probably middle to end of August, where you'll walk away from the idea of another application, right? And then it simply becomes a matter as you go into fall, if you're seeing more and more tar spot coming in, it becomes a harvest management piece now, right? Where you're watching for stalk integrity to start breaking down and setting your sights on harvesting fields earlier to make sure you reduce any potential loss or complications from the disease.
So, and same thing, of course, with GIB as well. As you mentioned earlier, Ken, prioritizing potentially those fields on the harvest side that you need to get off the field as quickly as possible, just for dawn
Yeah,
production
exactly.
and the like. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. If Jib does sneak in here and the crop wasn't protected or whatever, yeah, we need to evaluate that and get that crop out of the field as soon as we can, because it's just going to fester and grow, become more problematic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jason Vogt out of Manitoba has a question. Strobies versus the triazoles. So is tar spot, does Strobe cover tar spot better than the triazoles, or is it just that we're rotating mode of action? Do we know that yet? This is one of those questions of what do we know about tar spot so far?
You want me to jump in on that one, Linz?
Sure. Go
Yeah,
ahead, Ken.
so sure. Yeah, so definitely the Strobe mix fungicides in particular, and I think Albert alluded to it in the full video clip that we showed there, was those Strobe mix. The newer products really are the leaders when it comes to tar spot. So those multiple modes of action products versus the older singular mode of action products, right? The triazoles, for the most part, we think of the triazoles as the group 3 for ear rot management, right? And Gibberella management. One thing I've had to clarify a lot this year, because our new product is a mix of a Strobe and a group 3 isopropyl azole, Veltima, not Veltima, right? Veltima, as we were fiercely debating at the beginning of the show. But yeah, having to clarify that we do have a mixed group 3 in with that old pyraclostrobin component in Veltima. So just to clarify any confusion there, that is a group 3 for plant health and not for Dawn. You still have to add a Dawn or Gibberella product to Veltima. So, but yeah, short answer to Jason's questions: the Strobe mix products are the way to go.
Okay, good to know.
And the Tar Spot working group has great data there, Lyndsey. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, go ahead. So this is one of the things in preparing for this episode. I mean, we were going back and forth on trying to find some decent maps that were perhaps up to date. But this is a relatively new disease for Ontario and parts of the US. So I mean, we are still learning and still putting the resources together for sure. I know there is an app, the Tar Spotter app, and I know Pete has been covering it a bit on the Word on Wednesdays about, earlier this year we had 100% risk across the entire province. And we thought, well, that can't be right. But that was it wasn't saying there was infection. It was just saying conditions were conducive for potential infection or for the disease to develop. So, I mean, we've got some tools out there, but they're not necessarily perfect. And we're still learning a lot about this disease for sure. So, at least we've got some decent information in front of us. And thanks to both of you for sharing what we know in the field. I think, Greg, you've made a great point. And if you would like to dabble in plant breeding, I think a genetic marker for tar spot is a great idea. So we'll pass that along to all the plant breeders out there. Because I mean, this disease has moved quickly in Ontario, has it not? Like, it can potentially really cover some ground.
Yeah, it has moved in very, very quickly, right? And I mean, we are really, really quite lucky in Ontario to have the Great Lakes surrounding us, from a yield standpoint and all the things we can do, all the crops we can produce, right? But those lakes provide a very distinct environment that can breed a lot of disease as well, right? And it's not just us in southwestern Ontario who face those problems. The folks in Michigan and surrounding the Great Lakes, Ohio, New York, face a lot of the same problems that we do with these diseases. And while there are different kind of conditions that favor one over the other when you're talking tar spot or jib, they do line up very, very closely together, right? So they are it's not maybe as straightforward as just looking at one disease, that some folks in the Corn Belt are looking at tar spot and it's the only thing they're going to have to manage, or even as you go further east in Ontario and further east into eastern Canada, right, where your management of tar spot is going to look very differently potentially than the management you're going to have to employ for tar spot and jib risk in southwestern Ontario, right? Like you said, there's a lot of tools that we have at our disposal, but we're still learning so much more too, right? And specifically on the interaction of those two, I'm keen to learn more and find out more about what works from a field management standpoint, so that agronomists like myself, agronomists like Ken, and everyone who's out there working with growers can look at an individual operation, come up with the best possible solution, whether that's a 1-pass, whether that's a 2-pass, what that specific recipe is for that operation and the risks that are highest to them. I think that's really key.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, Ken, we're running out of time, but I would be remiss if I didn't give you the last word. So on this topic,
great.
Ken, yeah, the floor is yours.
No, absolutely. And then, I mean, Greg said a lot there, and I think what I'm most optimistic in, I mean, there's tools to manage this, and it's a full IPM toolbox for producers and agronomists. It's crop rotation, it's hybrid selection, it's the use of fungicides and rotating fungicide modes of action, and all the right things when it comes to an IPM approach. I'm amazed at how quickly the breeders in the corn breeding industry turned over genetics to get us past the northern corn leaf blight problems of 2010, 2011. As we recall here in Ontario, we saw a shift in disease races, I believe, or different. This might be a bad word, but variants, I guess. The breeders did a fantastic job, right? I mean, we're still managing northern corn leaf blight, but we're not seeing untreated acres get devastated like we did with susceptible hybrids, a little bit more than a decade ago. I'm pretty confident that we'll see the same thing with tar spot, and we'll still see we'll see the bottom end risk get taken out, but I think we'll still see all those tools in the IPM toolbox as part of managing disease in these the high value corn crop.
Absolutely. Now we shall all wait patiently to see what August brings. And hope it's not 2018. Let's just cross all of our things, fingers, toes, eyes, whichever. All right, and Greg, actually, you answered one of the questions that was in the chat, which is if certain weather patterns favor one disease over the other. But I think it's a key point to make is that I don't know, especially in the timing of these diseases, that you can really distinguish one from the other as far as what's going to favor one or the other. You're just going to have to monitor for both, depending on the weather. The environment seems to trump just about everything here. So, which is, of course, the one factor we can't control. So isn't that kind? No, not really. All right. Okay. Yeah. All right. We are out of time. Huge thank you to everyone who joined us on the call tonight. Some great questions, great conversation. Really appreciate it. Currah did correct me. We are on season 13 of the Wheat School. So thank you, Currah, for that. Time flies when you're having fun. So there you go. All right. Mr. Ken Currah, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
You're welcome.
All right. And Greg, thank you for taking a break from nighttime routine and joining us as well. It's been great to have you on the show the first time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute blast, and I'm more than happy to get away from that bedtime routine anytime you need.
I don't know. I'm not going to take you away too many times or else bad things happen. All right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, of course, to everyone in the comments who joined us tonight. Thank you to my two guests. This was a fantastic show. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow. Get those CEU credits. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Next week is a holiday, so this show will not be on, but come on back August 8th. We will be here 8 p.m. I will be here. I'm also taking all of next week off. So I'll see you around somewhere. Anyway, all right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, of course, to all of our show sponsors for making this happen. Mind Your Farm Business, ADAMA Canada, and the Wheat School. And we'll see you August 8th. Cheers, everybody.